The Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed 8 battleships in a single morning, believing they had broken the spine of American naval power. Yet the 3 aircraft carriers they failed to find would return within months to hunt down and sink 4 of the 6 Japanese carriers that executed the Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese had optimized their entire war plan around a target that no longer mattered. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. On November 26, 1941, 6 aircraft carriers slipped out of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, their decks laden with 414 warplanes. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the mobile force, the most powerful concentration of naval aviation ever assembled. Akagi and Kaga, converted from battlecruiser and battleship hulls, displaced over 36,000 tons each and carried more than 70 aircraft apiece. The newer Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built fleet carriers, brought speed and modern design. Shokaku and Zuikaku, commissioned mere months earlier, represented the apex of Japanese carrier engineering with their 25,675-ton displacement, 34-knot speed, and capacity for over 70 aircraft each. Together they carried 423 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, HED-3A Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, every one flown by pilots who had been honing their skills over China for years. The force steamed east across the North Pacific through weather so foul that American patrol aircraft couldn't fly and merchant vessels stayed in port. Radio silence held absolute. Every captain knew the consequences of a single transmission. The operation hinged on surprise, and surprise demanded invisibility. The fleet moved through seas where swells rose to 30 feet and spray froze on steel decks. Crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft lashed down and engines protected from salt and ice. Refueling operations at sea became exercises in seamanship as tankers pulled alongside heaving carriers to pass fuel lines in conditions that would have seemed suicidal in peacetime. The northern route kept the Kido Butai far from commercial shipping lanes. At these latitudes in late November, daylight lasted mere hours. Darkness provided concealment but made shipboard operations treacherous. Men moved carefully on ice-slick decks. Engine rooms maintained maximum efficiency on reduced manning to minimize noise and vibration that submarines might detect. The fleet traveled without running lights, ships maintaining formation by watching the phosphorescent wake of the vessel ahead. Navigation depended on celestial fixes taken during brief clear periods and dead reckoning the rest of the time. Any significant navigational error could scatter the formation or place them off. Schedule for the attack. Yamamoto had positioned 27 submarines along the route to Pearl Harbor and around Hawaiian waters to scout American movements and potentially intercept the Pacific Fleet if it sortied. 5 of these submarines carried midget submarines, 2-man vessels with a range of less than 100 miles and armed with 2 torpedoes. The plan called for these midget submarines to penetrate Pearl Harbor before the air attack and torpedo targets of opportunity. It was a desperate tactic reflecting Japanese willingness to sacrifice men when strategic objectives demanded it. The midget submarine crews understood their chances of survival approached zero. They went anyway, driven by Bushido, the warrior code that elevated duty and honor above life itself. The strike plan had been refined over months of intelligence gathering and war gaming. Japanese agents in Hawaii, particularly Ensign Tokyo Yoshikawa operating under diplomatic cover at the consulate in Honolulu, sent meticulous reports on ship movements, fleet dispositions, and defensive preparations. His messages arrived in Tokyo encoded in the purple cipher, detailing which battleships sat moored along the southeast shore of Ford Island, what would become known as Battleship Row, and confirming that carrier task forces periodically departed for operations but always returned to Pearl Harbor. The Americans followed predictable patterns. Weekends saw reduced alert status. Training flights concentrated on weekdays. Air patrols to the north remained minimal. The harbor itself, with depths averaging only 40 feet, seemed immune to torpedo attack. Conventional aerial torpedoes dropped from aircraft plunged as deep as 100 feet before leveling out, making them useless in Pearl Harbor's shallow basin. Japanese engineers solved that problem through modification of the Type 91 aerial torpedo. The standard weapon measured 18 feet long, weighed 1,841 pounds, and carried a 452-pound warhead capable of punching through battleship armor. But its tendency to dive deep after water entry made it unsuitable for Pearl Harbor's confined waters. Engineers at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal attached breakaway wooden fins to stabilize the torpedo's entry angle and modified the depth settings to produce a shallower trajectory. Test drops at Kagoshima Bay, where depths approximated those at Pearl Harbor, proved the modifications effective. The Type 91 Modification 2 could now be dropped from altitudes as low as 100 feet and would run true in water less than 40 feet deep. 40 specially modified torpedoes were allocated to the Pearl Harbor attack, each one representing months of calculation and testing. The tactical plan divided the assault into 2 waves. The first wave would launch 183 aircraft, 49 Kate high-level bombers carrying 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells, 40 Kate torpedo bombers carrying Type 91 torpedoes, 51 Val dive bombers targeting airfields, and 43 Zeros providing air cover. Commander Mitsu Fukaida would lead from his Kate bomber, coordinating the entire attack. The second wave, comprising 171 aircraft, would follow an hour later to strike targets missed or damaged by the first strike and suppress American defenses now fully alert. If needed, a third wave could target fuel storage tanks, dry docks, and repair facilities. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the entire operation, believed success required not just sinking ships but crippling infrastructure. Yet Yamamoto harbored deep reservations about the strategy itself. He had opposed war with America from the beginning, warning that Japan might achieve 6 months or perhaps a year of victories but could not sustain a prolonged conflict against American industrial capacity. When ordered to devise a plan anyway, he concluded that Japan's only chance lay in delivering a blow so devastating that American will to fight would collapse before their industrial machine could mobilize. The plan borrowed from Britain's November 1940 attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto, where Royal Navy torpedo bombers had crippled 3 battleships in a shallow harbor. If 21 obsolete Fairey Swordfish could accomplish that against a major naval power, what might 414 modern carrier aircraft achieve against a peacetime fleet at anchor? The target date, December 7, 1941, fell on a Sunday, when the maximum number of ships would be in port and crews would be enjoying shore leave. The date also preceded the winter monsoons that would make a northern approach route impossible. Timing demanded coordination with Japanese forces preparing to strike throughout the Pacific, simultaneous assaults on the Philippines, Malaya, Thailand, and Wake Island. The entire southern operation depended on neutralizing American naval power in the first hours of war. Without the Pacific Fleet to interfere, Japanese forces could seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter before America could react. On December 2, the coded message arrived at sea, Nitakayama Nobor, climb Mount Nitakaka. The operation was approved. The strike was on. Nagumo's fleet adjusted course directly for Hawaii, maintaining strict radio silence and maximum speed. Intelligence updates continued to filter through, relayed via radio from Tokyo. The American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, remained unlocated. Saratoga was confirmed to be on the west coast undergoing refit. Lexington and Enterprise, however, had departed Pearl Harbor on separate missions. Their locations remained unknown. This troubled Nagumo's staff. Carriers posed the only significant threat to the Kido Butai. Without knowing their positions, the strike force sailed into potential ambush. But the operation had progressed too far to abort. Fuel calculations gave no margin for delay. The attack would proceed. The American carriers had indeed left Pearl Harbor, but through operational necessity rather than any foreknowledge of Japanese intentions. USS Saratoga, having completed an overhaul at Puget Sound Naval Yard in Bremerton, Washington, had arrived in San Diego on December 7 to embark her air group. She was 2,600 miles from Pearl Harbor. USS Lexington, under Rear Admiral John H. Newton, had departed Pearl Harbor on December 5 with Task Force 12, ferrying 18 Marine Vought SB-2U Vindicator scout bombers to reinforce Midway Island's defenses. She steamed westward with an escort of 3 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers. USS Enterprise, under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, had departed November 28 with Task Force 8, delivering 12 Marine Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters to Wake Island. The mission completed December 4, Enterprise began the return voyage to Pearl Harbor. Heavy weather delayed her transit. At dawn December 7, she lay 215 miles west of Oahu, too far to intervene. None of these deployments reflected any warning of imminent attack. Rather, they reflected growing American concern about Japanese movements in the Pacific and the need to strengthen outlying bases. War warnings had indeed gone out from Washington, but these suggested Japanese action against the Philippines or Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. Pearl Harbor was considered too distant and too heavily defended to be at risk. The Hawaiian Department commander, Lieutenant General Walter Short, interpreted war warnings as alerts against sabotage by Hawaii's large Japanese-American population and ordered aircraft parked close together on runways for easier guarding, a decision that would prove catastrophic. At 6 a.m. on December 7, with a Kido Butai positioned 230 miles north of Oahu, the first wave launched. Deck crews worked with practiced precision despite swells that made the flight decks rise and fall. One by one, engines roaring, the strike aircraft lifted off into darkness. Fukaida circled overhead, waiting for the formation to assemble. As dawn broke behind them, 183 aircraft turned south toward Oahu. Radio operators monitored Hawaiian commercial radio stations broadcasting music and weather reports. The weather would be clear over the target. Visibility would be excellent. The calm voice of the announcer confirmed that nothing seemed amiss on the island below. The formation flew in precise combat order. Fukaida led from his Kate bomber, the command streamer trailing from his aircraft identifying him to the formation. High-level bombers flew at 10,000 feet in tight V formations. Torpedo bombers cruised at 7,000 feet, ready to descend for their attack runs. Dive bombers maintained 12,000 feet. Zero fighters wove above at 15,000 feet, scanning for American interceptors that never came. The pilots had studied reconnaissance photographs and models until they could navigate Pearl Harbor blindfolded. They knew which pier held which ship, which airfield held which type of aircraft, which direction to approach for minimum exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Training had been relentless, comprehensive, and utterly realistic. Mock-ups of Pearl Harbor had been constructed on Kyushu. Pilots had flown practice attacks until the approaches became muscle memory. Some pilots carried personal effects, letters to families, locks of hair, fingernail clippings, items traditional for warriors who might not return. Though American defenses were expected to be light, attacking a naval base was inherently dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire could kill as surely as fighters. Mechanical failure over open ocean meant death. The 2-hour flight from the carriers to Oahu and back represented the absolute limit of their fuel range. Any combat damage that increased fuel consumption or forced a detour could put an aircraft in the water short of the carriers. Rescue in these conditions would be difficult if not impossible. The pilots accepted these risks with the same fatalism that defined Bushido. The mission was everything. Personal survival was secondary. At 7:02 a.m., Army Privates Joseph Lawcock and George Elliott, manning the Opana Point radar station on Oahu's northern tip, detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north at 137 miles distance. They reported the contact to the Fort Shafter Information Center. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, alone on duty at the center because it was Sunday morning, concluded the contact must be a flight of B-17 bombers expected to arrive from California. He told them not to worry about it. The radar operators shut down their equipment at 7:45 a.m. as scheduled. The first wave passed overhead minutes later, undetected and unchallenged. Fukaida observed Pearl Harbor spread below in the morning light. 7 battleships sat moored in pairs along Battleship Row on the southeast side of Ford Island. Another, Pennsylvania, sat in dry dock at the Navy Yard. The battleship Utah, converted to a target ship, lay northwest of Ford Island. Cruisers, destroyers, tenders, and support vessels filled the harbor. But no carriers sat at their berths. The 3 most valuable targets were absent. Fukaida radioed the code word, Tora. 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 Tiger. 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 Indicating complete surprise achieved. Then he gave the command to attack. 8 torpedo bombers swept in from multiple directions, dropping to 50 feet above the water as they began their runs on Battleship Row. Each carried a single Type 91 Modification 2 torpedo set to run at 30 feet depth. The pilots had trained for months on models of Pearl Harbor, memorizing every approach, every landmark, every ship position. Now they executed those rehearsals for real. The first torpedo struck USS Oklahoma on her port side at 7:55 a.m. Within 2 minutes, 4 more torpedoes had torn into her hull. Oklahoma listed rapidly to port as water flooded her compartments. Damage control efforts proved futile. The list increased beyond recovery. At 8:08 a.m., 13 minutes after the first hit, Oklahoma capsized completely, trapping over 400 men inside her upturned hull. 429 crewmen would die. USS West Virginia, moored outboard of Tennessee, absorbed 6 torpedo hits in rapid succession within 5 minutes. Each 1,841-pound torpedo carried 452 pounds of high explosive. The detonations opened massive holes in her hull plating, admitting thousands of tons of water. Her commanding officer, Captain Mervyn Benyon, was mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb hit on Tennessee when fragments tore through his abdomen. Despite dying, he refused to leave his post, continuing to issue orders until he lost consciousness. Lieutenant Commander Dwyer Johnson took command and ordered selective counter-flooding, deliberately flooding compartments on the undamaged starboard side to counteract the port list. This desperate measure, executed by damage control parties working in darkness and smoke with water rising around them, kept West Virginia from capsizing like Oklahoma. She settled upright onto the harbor bottom with her superstructure still above water. 106 men died, but counter-flooding saved hundreds more who would have been trapped had she capsized. USS California, moored alone at Battleship Row's southern end, presented an isolated target. 2 Type 91 torpedoes struck her port side within minutes. One exploded in a fuel tank, igniting oil and starting fires. The other flooded 2 engine rooms. California had been in a material condition allowing rapid watertight door closure, but many doors and hatches had been opened for an inspection scheduled that morning. Water spread through the ship via these open passages. With power lost, pumps failed. Crews organized bucket brigades, literally passing buckets of water hand to hand, in a futile attempt to control flooding. California slowly settled over 3 days. Salvage crews could only watch as she gradually sank until her superstructure barely cleared the water. 100 men perished, many trapped below as compartments flooded. USS Nevada, moored alone at Battleship Row's northern end, was the fleet's oldest battleship but in many ways the most modern in terms of damage control and propulsion. She took 1 torpedo hit to her port bow at 8 a.m. But her engineering crew managed to maintain steam, and her commanding officer, Captain Francis Scanland, was ashore. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas took the con and made the audacious decision to get underway. As Nevada began moving, every Japanese pilot saw her. She became the target of concentrated attack. Bombs rained down. One penetrated her forecastle and exploded. Another struck near the bridge. Fires spread across the forward sections. Nevada's anti-aircraft crews maintained continuous fire even as their ship burned. Realizing Nevada might sink in the channel and block the harbor entrance, precisely what the Japanese hoped, Harbor Control ordered her beached. Thomas deliberately grounded Nevada at Hospital Point. She settled into the mud with her engineering spaces flooded but her guns still manned. Her sortie, though brief, demonstrated American will to fight even under devastating attack. While torpedo bombers focused on Battleship Row, high-level bombers approached from 10,000 feet. Each carried a single 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb, a naval shell fitted with fins and a modified fuse designed to pierce battleship deck armor before detonating. At 8:10 a.m., one of these weapons struck USS Arizona near her forward magazines. The bomb penetrated the deck, detonated among powder charges for the forward turrets, and ignited over 1 million pounds of smokeless powder. The explosion vaporized the forward part of the ship. A fireball rose 500 feet. The shockwave was felt across the harbor. Arizona settled to the bottom in 9 minutes, her superstructure a twisted wreck, oil burning on the water around her. 1,177 men died, nearly half of all American fatalities that morning. Dive bombers and fighters strafed airfields across Oahu. At Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, Bellows Field, and Kaneohe Naval Air Station, rows of parked aircraft, clustered together against sabotage per General Short's orders, made perfect targets. Zeros and Vals swept over the fields in repeated runs, dropping bombs and firing machine guns. Within minutes, the majority of American aircraft on Oahu were destroyed on the ground. Few managed to get airborne. Those that did faced veteran Japanese pilots in superior aircraft. The Americans fought courageously but chaotically. Second Lieutenants George Welsh and Kenneth Taylor, having managed to reach their Pier-40 fighters at Haleywa Field, claimed 7 kills between them. But organized defense proved impossible. The Americans had been caught completely by surprise. The second wave arrived at 8:54 a.m. Commander Shimazaki Shigekazu led 167 aircraft, 54 Kate high-level bombers, 78 Val dive bombers, and 35 Zeros. They found a very different situation than the first wave. The harbor billowed smoke from burning ships. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Alert defenders manned every gun. The second wave's losses would be proportionally higher. But they pressed their attacks, targeting ships missed by the first wave and hitting damaged vessels again. Dive bombers concentrated on Nevada, already beached, and on Pennsylvania in dry dock. The destroyers Cassin and Downs, in dry dock alongside Pennsylvania, were hit repeatedly and burned. The light cruiser Helena and the destroyer Shaw were severely damaged. Shaw's forward magazine detonated in a spectacular explosion photographed from multiple angles and later seen worldwide. By 9:45 a.m., the last Japanese aircraft departed. The harbor lay shrouded in smoke and flame. Arizona burned uncontrollably, her magazine still exploding periodically. Oklahoma lay capsized. California and West Virginia sat on the bottom. Maryland and Tennessee, moored inboard of Oklahoma and West Virginia, had sustained bomb damage but remained operational. Nevada sat beached. Pennsylvania in dry dock had taken 1 bomb hit. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. 11 other ships sunk or severely damaged. 188 aircraft destroyed and 159 damaged. 2,403 Americans killed and 1,178 wounded. Japanese losses totaled 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men killed. Nagumo's staff urged a third wave to destroy fuel storage tanks holding 4.5 million barrels of oil, the Navy Yard facilities, and submarine base. Commander Minoru Genda, the operations tactical architect, argued passionately that incomplete destruction would allow rapid American recovery. But Nagumo refused. His force had accomplished its primary mission, neutralizing the Pacific Fleet's battle line. The American carriers remained unlocated. Having broken radio silence during the attack, the fleet's position was no longer secret. Remaining longer risked American air counterattack. Fuel reserves were already running low for the return voyage. The third wave would not launch. At 1:30 p.m., the Kido Butai turned northwest and withdrew at high speed toward Japan. They had destroyed the American battle line completely. But they had missed the carriers. The immediate aftermath saw shock and confusion in Washington. President Roosevelt delivered his Day of Infamy speech to Congress on December 8. America declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on America 3 days later. The war had become truly global. But while the Pearl Harbor attack stunned America and provided short-term advantage to Japan, it failed strategically in multiple critical ways. First, the carriers had survived. Saratoga departed San Diego for Hawaii immediately, arriving December 15. Enterprise entered Pearl Harbor on the evening of December 7, her aircraft having arrived earlier to find the base under attack and several shot down by confused American defenders. Lexington returned December 13. Within a week, all three carriers were operational and available for action. The battleships, which Japanese planning assumed were the heart of American naval power, had indeed been shattered. But naval warfare was transitioning from battleship-centric to carrier-centric combat, a transition Japanese' own carrier doctrine ironically proved. By destroying obsolete battleships while missing the carriers, Japan had eliminated assets of declining importance while leaving America's most valuable striking power intact. Second, the infrastructure survived. The fuel farms gender begged to destroy held petroleum products essential for fleet operations. Their destruction would have forced the Pacific Fleet to withdraw to the west coast, ceding the entire Central Pacific to Japan and delaying American counteroffensives by a year or more. The Navy yards, repair facilities, machine shops, and dry docks remained intact. The submarine base was untouched. Within weeks, salvage operations began raising sunken ships. California, West Virginia, and Nevada would be raised, repaired, and returned to service. Only Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses. This rapid recovery, impossible without intact base facilities, meant American strength regenerated far faster than Japanese planners expected. Third, the attack unified American public opinion completely. Before Pearl Harbor, isolationist sentiment remained strong. Polls showed Americans deeply divided about entering the war. Pearl Harbor ended the debate instantly. The attack was seen as treacherous, the formal declaration of war had been delayed by embassy difficulties and arrived after the attack began, and it galvanized a previously reluctant population. Japanese planners had hoped a devastating blow would discourage American will to fight. Instead, it produced the opposite effect, total national commitment to victory regardless of cost. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry that sustained American morale through the darkest days that followed. Fourth, American cryptanalysts had been reading Japanese diplomatic codes for months through the MAGIC program. While MAGIC had not revealed the Pearl Harbor attack, military codes remained secure. It provided valuable insight into Japanese intentions and capabilities. After Pearl Harbor, cryptanalytic efforts intensified dramatically. By spring 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort's station HYPO at Pearl Harbor had made significant progress breaking Japanese naval code JN-25. This intelligence would prove decisive in the carrier battles to come. The three American carriers that escaped Pearl Harbor didn't remain idle. Frustrated by having missed the battle and hungry to strike back, American commanders devised aggressive operations to harass Japanese positions even as Japan continued its southern advance. The raids would accomplish little material damage but would have profound strategic consequences far outweighing their tactical results. The psychological impact of these carrier raids on both sides cannot be overstated. For American forces reeling from defeat after defeat, the Philippines falling, Singapore surrendering, the Dutch East Indies overwhelmed, the carrier raids provided rare moments of striking back. Newsreels showed American aircraft bombing Japanese positions. Newspapers reported successful raids against enemy installations. Public morale, devastated by Pearl Harbor and the subsequent string of losses, desperately needed evidence that America could fight back. The carrier raids provided that evidence. For Japanese forces, the raids revealed uncomfortable truths. American carriers were not huddling defensively around Pearl Harbor awaiting destruction. They were prowling aggressively, appearing unexpectedly, striking, and withdrawing before Japanese forces could respond. The doctrine of decisive battle, bringing the enemy fleet to action and destroying it in one climactic engagement, presumed the enemy would cooperate by appearing where expected. American carriers refused to cooperate. They struck at the periphery, small bases, exposed positions, vulnerable installations. They avoided major fleet engagements until circumstances favored them. This strategic approach frustrated Japanese planning predicated on forcing decisive battle on favorable terms. Moreover, the raids demonstrated that American forces were learning rapidly. Early raids saw coordination problems, navigation errors, and tactical mistakes. But each operation refined procedures. Fighter direction improved. strike coordination became more efficient. Damage assessment became more accurate. The aggressive operations provided combat experience for crews who would later fight at Coral Sea and Midway. Pilots learned to find targets at sea, navigate long distances over water, and coordinate attacks. These skills, developed through the early raids, would prove decisive in the carrier battles to come. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived December 31 to assume command of Pacific Fleet from Admiral Husband Kimmel, who had been relieved after Pearl Harbor. Nimitz faced a desperate situation. Japanese forces were overrunning the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. American and Allied forces were in full retreat across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Wake Island, defended heroically by Marines and the F-4F Wildcats Enterprise had delivered, fell December 23 after a 16-day siege. Guam had been captured December 10. Only the carriers offered any capability for offensive action. Nimitz decided to use them aggressively, trading strategic vulnerability for the psychological value of proving America could still fight. On January 11, 1942, Saratoga was torpedoed by Japanese submarine IS-6 500 miles southwest of Oahu. The torpedo struck her starboard side, flooding 3 fire rooms and causing her to list 11 degrees. 1 man died and her speed dropped to 13 knots. She limped back to Pearl Harbor, then continued to Puget Sound for repairs lasting until May. The 3-carrier force was now 2. On February 1, 1942, Task Force 8 built around Enterprise and Task Force 17 built around Yorktown, transferred from the Atlantic, struck Japanese bases in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Enterprise aircraft raided Kwajalein, Watya, and Maloelap while Yorktown hit Markin and Jaluit. The attacks achieved surprise and damaged shipping and facilities, but inflicted minimal strategic damage. 1 Japanese transport was sunk, several aircraft destroyed. American losses included 6 aircraft. But the raids proved American carriers could strike Japanese-held positions and withdraw safely. More importantly, they provided crucial combat experience for American carrier pilots and proved that aggressive action was possible despite numerical inferiority. On February 20, Vice Admiral Wilson Brown commanding Task Force 11 around Lexington attempted to raid Rabaul, Japan's major base in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese reconnaissance spotted the force, and the element of surprise was lost. 18 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers attacked Lexington. The carrier's combat air patrol of F-4F Wildcats, directed by radar, intercepted the attackers 50 miles out. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch led the defending fighters, developing the tactics he would later formalize as the Thatch Weave to counter the more maneuverable Zero. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down 17 of 18 Bettys without damage to Lexington. The failed raid became a defensive victory, proving American fighters could defeat Japanese bombers when properly coordinated by radar, a lesson that would prove vital at Midway. On February 24, Enterprise raided Wake Island. On March 4, Enterprise and Lexington combined to strike Marcus Island, only 1,000 miles from Tokyo. On March 10, Lexington launched attacks on Lae and Salamaua on New Guinea's northern coast, sinking or damaging several ships supporting Japanese operations against Port Moresby. These pinprick raids inflicted minimal material damage but tied down Japanese forces, delayed their advance, and maintained American morale during the darkest period of the war. The most audacious operation came in April. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle proposed launching Army Air Force B-25 Mitchell medium bombers from an aircraft carrier to raid Tokyo itself. The B-25s, with 75-foot wingspans, had never been launched from a carrier before. They were far too large to land on one. Crews would have to take off, bomb Japan, then continue to China to land at friendly airfields. The plan was operationally risky and strategically questionable. 16 bombers couldn't inflict significant damage on Japan, but psychologically it was brilliant. Bombing Japan would boost American morale and demonstrate that Japan's homeland was vulnerable. Yamamoto had promised the Emperor that Japan itself would never face attack. Hornet, commissioned the previous October, loaded 16 B-25s on her deck at Alameda Naval Air Station on April 2. The bombers occupied so much space that Hornet couldn't operate her own aircraft. Enterprise, with Task Force 16, would provide air cover. The combined force sortied April 8, heading west across the Pacific. The launch point was set for 400 miles from Japan, the minimum distance allowing the B-25s to reach Chinese airfields after bombing. On April 18, while still 650 miles from Japan, Japanese picket boats spotted the task force. To preserve surprise and prevent the pickets from reporting the carrier's position, the boats were sunk by gunfire. But Doolittle and Halsey agreed the force had been compromised. Rather than abort, they decided to launch immediately despite being 300 miles farther from Japan than planned. At 8:20 a.m., all 16 B-25s launched successfully from Hornet's pitching deck, an extraordinary feat of airmanship. They flew onto Japan at low altitude. Shortly after noon, they arrived over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Each carried for 500-pound bombs. They struck military and industrial targets, then headed west for China. All 16 aircraft reached China but ran out of fuel. Crews bailed out or crash-landed. 11 crews were rescued by Chinese forces. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces in occupied China, 3 were executed, 1 died in captivity. Another crew landed in Soviet territory and was interned. 71 of 80 crewmen survived. Material damage was negligible, about 50 people killed, 90 buildings damaged, minor fires. Strategically, the raid was transformative. It proved Japan's air defenses were inadequate. It shocked Japanese leaders and public, who had been assured the homeland was invulnerable. It forced Japan to retain combat aircraft in home defense that were desperately needed in the South Pacific. Most critically, it convinced Yamamoto that eliminating the American carrier threat had become urgent. The carriers were not defending American positions in the South Pacific, they were prowling aggressively, striking when least expected. They had now hit Tokyo itself. Yamamoto concluded they had to be destroyed. This conclusion drove Japanese planning toward Midway. Yamamoto proposed occupying Midway Island, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and threaten Pearl Harbor itself. More importantly, he predicted that seizing Midway would force the Pacific Fleet, specifically its carriers, to come out and fight. The combined fleet would ambush and destroy them in a decisive engagement. With American carriers eliminated, Japan could consolidate its Pacific empire and negotiate a favorable peace. The plan drew opposition from Naval General Staff, who preferred continuing the advance toward Australia and isolating that continent from America. They argued that seizing Port Moresby would cut Australia's supply lines and force America to commit carriers to defend Australia itself, a battle that could be fought closer to Japanese bases with better support. Yamamoto countered that Midway offered decisive results. Australia could be isolated later. But the American carriers had to be destroyed now, before their numbers increased and before American industrial production created insurmountable numerical superiority. The debate within Japanese high command reflected deeper tensions between conservative Navy staff officers who favored methodical advance and aggressive combined fleet officers who sought decisive battle. Yamamoto's prestige after Pearl Harbor was immense. He was seen as the architect of Japan's greatest naval victory. His threat to resign if the Midway operation wasn't approved carried weight that no other officer could match. The Naval General Staff capitulated. The Midway operation was approved, though many staff officers remained skeptical. The operation's complexity, simultaneous operations at Midway and the Aleutian Islands, multiple force components approaching from different directions. Precise timing requirements worried them. But Yamamoto's confidence was absolute. The Americans would take the bait. Their carriers would sortie. The ambush would succeed. Japanese planning assumed 4 or 5 American carriers would respond to a Midway invasion. Intelligence estimated Lexington and Yorktown had been sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, an engagement that resulted from Japan's attempt to capture Port Moresby. In fact, Lexington had been sunk but Yorktown survived, damaged but repairable. Saratoga had completed repairs but was still working up on the west coast. Wasp remained in the Atlantic. Hornet and Enterprise were available and undamaged. When Yorktown arrived at Pearl Harbor on May 27 with major damage from Coral Sea, the situation appeared hopeless. A bomb hit had penetrated 3 decks before exploding. The blast had ruptured fuel tanks and torn open seams. Her flight deck was holed. Her boilers were damaged. Structural frames were warped. Under normal circumstances, repairs would require 3 months in dry dock. But Nimitz needed every carrier for Midway. He ordered emergency repairs compressed into 3 days. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard mobilized 1,400 workers who swarmed over Yorktown around the clock. Welders worked in shifts. Carpenters shored damaged structures. Electricians rewired systems. Plumbers patched ruptured lines. The work proceeded in overlapping waves with crews stepping over each other to complete critical repairs. When Yorktown sortied May 30, civilian workers were still aboard making last-minute fixes. Her wounds were patched but not healed. Compartments remained flooded. Systems remained jury-rigged. But she could launch aircraft, and that made her combat-ready enough. Nimitz would have 3 carriers, barely, to meet Yamamoto's 4. But Nimitz held a decisive advantage. Station HYPO had broken enough of JN-25 to reveal Midway as the target and early June as the timing. Rochefort's team worked frantically, sometimes sleeping under their desks, to extract every fragment of intelligence from intercepted transmissions. The code breakers worked in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, a hot, windowless space where cigarette smoke mixed with the smell of overworked electrical equipment. They parsed encrypted messages character by character, building probability tables and testing hypotheses against intercepts. The work demanded mathematical precision combined with intuitive leaps about Japanese operational planning. A clever ruse confirmed Midway as the target. American forces at Midway were instructed to send an uncoded message reporting their water distillation plant had broken down. Shortly after, HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF, the Japanese code name for their target, was short of fresh water. Midway was definitively confirmed. Rochefort had given Nimitz the intelligence foundation for ambush. Now execution would determine victory or defeat. Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, carefully calculated to remain outside the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, to ambush the Kido Butai when it approached to launch strikes on the island garrison at Midway. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the overall American operation aboard the carrier Yorktown with Task Force 17. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, replacing the aggressive Halsey who was hospitalized with a severe skin condition, commanded Enterprise and Hornet with Task Force 16. Together they had 233 aircraft against Nagumo's 248 from the 4 Japanese carriers. Nagumo didn't know the American carriers were anywhere near Midway. He expected them to be hundreds of miles away at Pearl Harbor or even back at West Coast ports. The trap was set. On June 4, at 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched 108 aircraft, Zeros, Vals, and Kates, to strike Midway Island. He held reserves in case American carriers appeared, but expected none. At 5:34 a.m., a PBY Catalina flying boat from Midway spotted the Kido Butai and radioed its position. At 5:52 a.m., another PBY spotted the incoming Japanese strike force. Every operable aircraft on Midway scrambled. Fighters engaged the incoming Japanese aircraft but were badly outnumbered and outclassed. The Japanese struck Midway's installations heavily, but the island's defenses, reinforced over weeks, fought back effectively. Damage was significant but not crippling. At 7 a.m., the strike leader radioed Nagumo that a second attack on Midway would be necessary. Nagumo ordered the 93 reserve aircraft, currently armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for use against land targets. Deck crews began the laborious process of striking torpedoes and bombs below and bringing up different ordnance. At 7:15 a.m., a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft launched late due to catapult problems radioed a sighting of American ships. At 7:40 a.m., a follow-up message added, "The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. Half his aircraft were returning from Midway needing to land and refuel. Half were having their armament changed. Combat Air Patrol Zeros were running low on fuel. An American carrier was nearby, but its exact position and strength were unknown. Nagumo decided to recover his Midway strike force first, then launch a fully coordinated attack against the American carrier. He ordered rearming operations reversed, switched back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Deck crews worked frantically, stacking bombs and torpedoes on the hangar decks to clear space faster. Discipline gave way to urgency. Safety protocols were abandoned. At 8:37 a.m., the last aircraft from the Midway strike landed. Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind to launch his strike against the American fleet. But American carrier aircraft were already inbound. Fletcher had launched aircraft from all three carriers beginning at 7 a.m. once the Japanese force was located. The attacks were uncoordinated, each carrier group approached independently. The Americans had no time to organize a combined strike. Different squadrons flew at different speeds and altitudes. Fighter escorts burned too much fuel trying to protect slow torpedo bombers and had to turn back. Dive bombers lost sight of torpedo bombers in clouds. Radio communication between squadrons was sporadic. The American attack developed as a series of piecemeal assaults rather than the coordinated strike doctrine called for. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, 15 Douglas TBD Devastators carrying Mark 13 torpedoes, attacked first at 9:20 a.m. under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. The TBD Devastator, when introduced in 1937, had been the world's most advanced carrier torpedo bomber. By 1942 it was obsolete. Maximum speed of 206 miles per hour made it vulnerable. Torpedo runs required straight, level flight at low altitude, ideal conditions for anti-aircraft fire. The Mark 13 torpedo itself was notoriously unreliable, with high dud rates and tendency to run deep or off course. But the TBD crews pressed their attacks with extraordinary courage. Waldron led his squadron directly at Akagi and Kaga without fighter escort or dive bomber support. Japanese Zeros swarmed down on them. Type 99 cannons and 7.7 mm machine guns ripped through fabric control surfaces and aluminum structures. Devastators staggered, caught fire, and plunged into the sea one after another. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and escorts filled the air with bursting shells. Waldron's aircraft was among the first hit. It burned and crashed. Every single one of the 15 Devastators was shot down within minutes. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, whose aircraft was the last to go down. Gay freed himself from his sinking aircraft, inflated his life vest, and pulled his seat cushion over himself as camouflage. For hours he floated amid the wreckage, watching the entire battle unfold around him. Not one torpedo launched by Torpedo Squadron 8 found its target. 15 aircraft. 30 men. All gone. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, 14 TBDs under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, attacked next. They approached from a different angle, hoping to split Japanese defenses. The result was identical. Zeros pounced. Anti-aircraft fire bracketed the slow-moving torpedo bombers. 10 of 14 were shot down. Lindsay's aircraft was hit repeatedly and crashed. The 4 survivors struggled back to Enterprise. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 12 TBDs led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, attacked at 10 a.m. with 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters as escort. The Wildcats tried desperately to engage the Zeros but were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. 10 Devastators were shot down including Massey's. No hits. Of 41 American torpedo bombers committed to the attack, 35 had been destroyed. 80% casualty rate. The survivors limped back to their carriers damaged and traumatized. The Mark 13 torpedoes that were launched either missed, ran deep, or failed to detonate. Not a single Japanese carrier had been touched. On the Japanese carriers, jubilation reigned. The American attack had been beaten off with ease. Nagumo's force remained fully operational. Japanese victory seemed not just assured but overwhelming. Staff officers began calculating the pursuit of the retreating American carriers. Within hours they would finish what Pearl Harbor started, complete destruction of the American carrier force. But the torpedo attacks had drawn Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level and pulled the Zeros out of position. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise, 33 SBD Dauntless under Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, found the Japanese carriers. The decks were crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed for the counterstrike. Hoses snaked across the flight decks. Ordnance sat exposed. The carriers were supremely vulnerable. McCluskey split his formation. Half rolled into their dives on Kaga. Half followed him down on Akagi. From 14,000 feet, the SBDs plummeted nearly vertical, pilots squinting through their sights at the carriers growing larger below, waiting until 2,500 feet to release. Kaga took for direct hits within 2 minutes. Bombs penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the crowded hangar. Fuel fires ignited immediately. Armed aircraft exploded. Torpedoes cooked off. Within minutes, Kaga was a roaring inferno. Akagi took 2 bombs, one of which detonated near the aircraft elevator, jamming it and starting massive fires on the hangar deck. Almost simultaneously, 17 SBDs from Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3, attacked Sarayu. 3 bombs struck home. Sarayu's forward elevator was blown onto her bridge. Fires consumed the ship. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. Akagi burned uncontrollably until abandoned that afternoon and scuttled by destroyer torpedoes. Kaga exploded repeatedly as fires reached magazines and aviation fuel tanks. She sank at 7:25 p.m. Sarayu, her back broken, sank at 7:13 p.m. Only Hiryu remained operational. At 10:40 a.m., she launched 18 VAL dive bombers and 6 Zeros to attack the American carriers. At 12:10 p.m., they found Yorktown. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol, several VALs broke through. 3 bombs hit Yorktown. 1 penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the lower decks. Another detonated in the smokestack, snuffing out fires in 5 of 9 boilers. Yorktown lost power and slowed to 6 knots. Damage control parties worked frantically. Fires were controlled. Boilers relit. By 1:40 p.m., Yorktown was making 19 knots and preparing to resume flight operations. At 2:30 p.m., a second wave from Hiryu, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros, attacked. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side. Power failed completely. The list increased to 26 degrees. At 3 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship, fearing she would capsize. But Enterprise and Hornet aircraft had located Hiryu. At 5 p.m., 24 dive bombers from Enterprise attacked. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck and hangar. Like her sisters, Hiryu became an inferno. By evening, the entire Kido Butai, all 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was destroyed or dying. Hiryu burned through the night and was scuttled by Japanese destroyers the next morning. Yorktown, though abandoned, refused to sink. Salvage crews reboarded her June 5, hoping to tow her to Pearl Harbor. But submarine IA-168 found her on June 6 and put 4 torpedoes into her. Yorktown finally sank June 7, along with the destroyer Hammond that was moored alongside her. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 men, including many of her most experienced pilots and maintenance crews. American losses were 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Japan's carrier striking power, carefully built over 2 decades of intensive training and construction, was shattered in a single day. The strategic balance in the Pacific shifted decisively and irrevocably. Japan would never again achieve the concentration of force that had struck Pearl Harbor. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu, and Hiryu, included 4 of the 6 that had launched the December 7 attack. Shokaku and Zuikaku survived Midway, but they were now irreplaceable. Japanese shipyards were already working at capacity, producing escort ships, submarines, and replacement merchant vessels for the convoy route sustaining the southern resource area. Large carrier construction demanded facilities, materials, and skilled labor already stretched thin. Japan's pre-war carrier construction program had produced fleet carriers at a rate of roughly one per year. Shokaku and Zuikaku, commissioned in 1941, represented the culmination of that program. New carriers were under construction: the Taiho, an armored carrier incorporating lessons from early war experience, and conversions of Shinano, originally a Yamato-class battleship, and several smaller hulls. But Taiho wouldn't commission until March 1944. Shinano wouldn't commission until November 1944. Smaller conversions like Hyo and Junyo had been commissioned in mid-1942, but they were conversions of passenger liner hulls with limited speed, aircraft capacity, and damage resistance compared to purpose-built fleet carriers. Japan could not replace Midway's losses with equivalent tonnage for years. American production, by contrast, was just beginning to accelerate. The Essex-class program had been authorized in 1940 with first hulls laid down in 1941. These were 27,100-ton fleet carriers with armored hangar decks, comprehensive damage control systems, and capacity for 100 aircraft. Construction time averaged 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. USS Essex commissioned December 31, 1942. Yorktown II commissioned April 1943. Intrepid commissioned August 1943. The tempo continued throughout the war. 24 Essex-class carriers would commission between 1942 and 1950, with 17 seeing combat in World War II. Each one was larger, faster, and more capable than any Japanese carrier. Independence-class light carriers augmented the Essex-class. These were Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls converted on the building ways to light carriers. They displaced 11,000 tons, carried 33 aircraft, and could make 31 knots. 9 Independence-class carriers commissioned between January and December 1943. Though smaller than fleet carriers, they provided invaluable additional striking power and allowed fleet carrier deployment flexibility. By late 1943, American task forces routinely operated with 4 or 5 carriers, more than the entire Kido Butai at Pearl Harbor. Japanese industry lacked the raw material resources, electrical generation capacity, machine tool base, and trained workforce to match American production. Steel output: America produced 80 million tons. Annually, Japan produced 7 million tons. Aircraft production: America would build 324,000 aircraft during the war, Japan would build 76,000. Pilot training: America graduated 193,000 pilots during the war, Japan graduated perhaps 40,000. The disparity extended to every category: ships, submarines, weapons, vehicles, electronics. American war production exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy by 1943. The arsenal of democracy that Yamamoto feared had fully mobilized. America, meanwhile, was just beginning to mobilize. Essex-class fleet carriers, 27,100 tons, 36 knots, 100 aircraft capacity, were already under construction. The first, Essex, would commission December 1942. Independence-class light carriers, converted from light cruiser hulls, would begin entering service early 1943. By late 1943, the Pacific Fleet would have more carriers than Japan had possessed at the beginning of the war. Each would have newer aircraft, better trained pilots, improved radar, and superior damage control. Japanese advantages in pilot experience and aircraft quality, real in 1941, were eroding rapidly. The 3 American carriers absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had survived to become instruments of strategic revenge. Enterprise participated in nearly every major Pacific engagement. Her aircraft damaged 2 carriers at Coral Sea, sank 2 at Midway, and she fought through Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. She was hit by kamikaze aircraft twice but survived and ended the war as America's most decorated ship. Saratoga, after her early torpedoing, returned to support operations at Guadalcanal and the Gilbert Islands. She survived the war and was expended in nuclear weapons tests at Bikini Atoll in 1946. Hornet, newest of the pre-war carriers, launched Doolittle's raid, fought at Midway, and supported Guadalcanal before being sunk by Japanese aircraft and destroyers at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942. She took over 100 bomb and torpedo hits before finally sinking. Lexington, sunk at Coral Sea, had stopped Japan's advance toward Port Moresby and Australia, a strategic victory despite her loss. Yorktown, sacrificed at Midway, had helped sink 3 Japanese carriers before her own destruction. The carriers Japan missed at Pearl Harbor had hunted down and destroyed the carriers that struck Pearl Harbor. Japanese strategic failure at Pearl Harbor cascaded through every subsequent decision. Yamamoto himself recognized it immediately. When congratulated on the attack's success, he reportedly expressed concern that they had awakened a sleeping giant. Whether he actually said this is uncertain, but his private correspondence confirms he understood the limitations of what they had achieved. The fuel tank survived. The carrier survived. The submarine base and repair facility survived. Most critically, American industrial capacity survived. Pearl Harbor brought America into the war united and determined. Everything that followed flowed from that decision. The Imperial Japanese Navy optimized its entire war plan around destroying battleships because battleships represented the decisive element in every naval battle since Tsushima in 1905. Yamamoto himself had commanded battleships. The battleship-centric doctrine was embedded in decades of training, planning, and construction. Yet Japan had also pioneered carrier aviation and developed the world's most powerful carrier force. The contradiction, using carriers to destroy battleships, revealed that Japanese strategic thinking hadn't fully internalized the implications of their own doctrine. Carriers had made battleships obsolescent. Pearl Harbor proved it. But Japan struck the obsolescent targets and missed the decisive ones. When Nagumo refused to authorize a third wave against Pearl Harbor's infrastructure, he made a tactically defensible decision that proved strategically disastrous. His carriers were exposed, their position compromised, and the American carriers' locations remained unknown. Withdrawing made operational sense. But those fuel tanks would power American counteroffensives. Those repair facilities would resurrect damaged ships. That submarine base would house the fleet that cut Japan's maritime supply lines. The 4.5 million barrels of oil Nagumo left burning would have forced Pacific Fleet withdrawal to the West Coast and postponed American counteroffensives by a year. A year might have allowed Japan to consolidate its conquests, fortify its perimeter, and present America with a fait accompli costly enough to negotiate from. Instead, within 6 months, American carriers were sinking Japanese carriers at Midway. The irony cuts deeper still. Japan initiated war because America's embargo threatened to strangle Japanese oil supplies. Japan needed Southeast Asian petroleum to sustain its war machine. The Southern operation aimed to seize those resources before oil reserves ran dry. Yet at Pearl Harbor, they chose not to destroy America's oil reserves. Yamamoto later said that destroying Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks would have prolonged the war another 2 years. But prolonging America's ability to fight was precisely what Japan needed to avoid. A crippled Pearl Harbor would have bought Japan time. Nagumo bought nothing. He delivered a partial victory that felt total but wasn't. American carrier doctrine evolved directly from Pearl Harbor's lessons. Carriers became the fleet's capital ships. Battleships became escorts. Task force composition centered on carrier striking power supported by cruisers and destroyers for anti-aircraft defense. Fast battleships eventually joined as floating anti-aircraft platforms with their heavy guns secondary. Carrier operations emphasized coordination, radar direction, combat air patrol doctrine, and damage control. The training programs that started immediately after Pearl Harbor produced an endless stream of pilots. By 1944, American carrier air groups were rotating through with pilots who had hundreds of training hours before seeing combat. Japanese training, constrained by fuel shortages and the need to defend against constant American attacks, declined in quality throughout the war. By 1945, Japanese pilots arrived at combat units with minimal training and life expectancies measured in weeks. Technology advanced as well. American radar improved continuously. Fire control systems became automated. Anti-aircraft guns multiplied. The VT proximity fuse, a miniature radar in an anti-aircraft shell that detonated when it sensed a nearby aircraft, came into service in 1943 and revolutionized anti-aircraft defense. American carriers could throw up walls of fire that shredded attacking formations. Japanese carriers, always more lightly built than American counterparts to maximize speed and aircraft capacity, lacked comparable defenses. When American submarines began targeting Japanese carriers in 1944, results were catastrophic. Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull and displacing 72,000 tons, the largest carrier ever built, was sunk by submarine on her maiden voyage in November 1944, 10 days after commissioning. The men who survived Pearl Harbor in those 3 absent carriers carried the burden of revenge. They knew what they had missed. Enterprise pilots arrived over Pearl Harbor December 7 to find the base burning and were fired on by panicked American gunners. Some were shot down by friendly fire. They landed to find friends dead and their base devastated. Lexington's crew heard about the attack by radio while steaming toward Midway. They ached to turn back but were too far away to help. Saratoga's crew learned of it while in San Diego and spent the transit to Hawaii wondering what they would find. These men, pilots, gunners, plane handlers, engineers, spent the next 4 years fighting across the Pacific with Pearl Harbor's smoke etched in memory. The strategic equation was simple: Japan began war with 10 aircraft carriers. America had 7, 3 of which survived Pearl Harbor untouched. But America would build 141 carriers during the war. Japan would build 15. America would build 100,000 aircraft. Japan would build 70,000. American shipyards launched an Essex-class fleet carrier every 2 months by 1943. Japanese yards struggled to complete 1 carrier per year. The industrial disparity Yamamoto feared proved insurmountable. Every Japanese carrier sunk was irreplaceable. Every American carrier sunk was avenged by 2 more joining the fleet. The ultimate symbol of this disparity came in June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan committed 9 carriers with 473 aircraft to stop the American invasion of the Marianas. America deployed 15 carriers with 956 aircraft. Japanese pilots, poorly trained and flying obsolescent aircraft, attacked into comprehensive radar-directed fighter direction and massed anti-aircraft fire. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 carriers and 600 aircraft. American losses were 123 aircraft, mostly operational accidents. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan's remaining carriers acted as decoys. They had almost no aircraft aboard, to lure American carriers away from the main surface action. It worked tactically but failed strategically. The carriers Japan had once used to strike Pearl Harbor had become bait. The Pacific War's trajectory was set December 7, 1941, not by what Japan destroyed but by what it missed. The 3 carriers that escaped became 4, then 8, then 20, then 50. They hunted submarines in the Atlantic, covered amphibious landings in the Mediterranean, and dominated the Pacific. By 1945, American carrier task forces operated with impunity off Japan's coast, striking at will while Japanese carriers lay sunk or hiding in port with no fuel and no pilots. The strategic miscalculation, optimizing the entire operation around sinking battleships while missing carriers, had compounded into comprehensive defeat. The human cost of these strategic calculations remains incalculable. Every statistic represents men who died violently far from home. The 2,403 Americans killed at Pearl Harbor. The 3,057 Japanese killed at Midway. The hundreds of thousands who would die in subsequent battles across the Pacific. Each side believed they fought for survival. Japanese leaders genuinely feared Western encirclement and resource strangulation. American leaders saw Japanese aggression as fundamentally threatening to democratic civilization. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides demonstrated courage. The war became total, consuming entire societies and economies in the machinery of industrial-age warfare. Yet the fundamental strategic reality remained: Japan initiated a war it could not win. Pearl Harbor's partial success convinced Japanese leadership that America could be shocked into negotiated settlement. But America's response was not accommodation but fury. The three carriers that escaped Pearl Harbor became symbols of that fury. They represented not just military capability but American determination that the attack would be answered, completely and without mercy. The irony of Pearl Harbor lies in its completeness within its own terms and its failure within larger context. As a military operation, it was brilliantly executed. Surprise was total. Damage was extensive. Losses were minimal. Every objective was achieved. But the objectives themselves were flawed. Sinking battleships didn't cripple American naval power because battleships no longer represented naval power's decisive element. Missing the carriers meant missing the actual threat. Leaving infrastructure intact meant American recovery would be swift. Unifying American opinion meant the enemy would never negotiate. Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically and failed strategically because it was optimized for the wrong war, the battleship war of 1905, not the carrier war of 1941. The three carriers absent on December 7 would spend the next 4 years prosecuting the war Pearl Harbor started. Enterprise fought at Midway, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, surviving kamikaze hits and near misses that would have sunk lesser ships. Saratoga operated from the Solomons to the Philippines, providing air support for amphibious landings and strikes against Japanese positions. She survived torpedoing by submarine, and kamikaze attacks that killed or wounded hundreds of her crew. Hornet launched Doolittle's raid and fought at Midway before going down fighting at Santa Cruz, her pilots continuing to fly missions even as their ship burned beneath them. These ships and their crews embodied the transformation of American naval doctrine from battleship-centric to carrier-centric warfare. By 1945, the Pacific Fleet operated with impunity off Japan's coast. Task Force 38, under Admiral Halsey, the same Halsey who had commanded Enterprise when Pearl Harbor was attacked, routinely launched strikes against targets throughout the Japanese home islands. Japanese carriers, when they could sortie at all, lacked fuel for sustained operations and pilots capable of effective combat. The last carrier battle, Cape Ingano in October 1944, saw American aircraft massacre Japanese carriers that served merely as bait in a desperate plan to draw American carriers away from Leyte Gulf. The plan worked tactically but failed strategically. Halsey took the bait, but MacArthur's landing succeeded anyway, and Japan lost 4 carriers to no purpose. The final accounting reveals the asymmetry Pearl Harbor created. Japan lost 11 fleet and light carriers sunk during the war: Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu, Hiryu at Midway, Ryujo at Eastern Solomons, Shoho at Coral Sea, Shokaku and Taiho at Philippine Sea, Zuikaku at Cape Ingano, Shinano to submarine, Hyo to submarine. America lost 4 fleet carriers: Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Hornet at Santa Cruz, Wasp to submarine. The exchange rate favored America nearly 3-1. But the production rate disparity meant that for every American carrier lost, 3 more joined the fleet. For every Japanese carrier lost, none replaced it. The strategic mistake, attacking Pearl Harbor's battleships while missing its carriers, defined the entire Pacific War. Japan optimized its plan for yesterday's warfare and executed it brilliantly. But warfare had changed. The carriers Japan's own doctrine relied upon had made battleships secondary. By sinking battleships while missing carriers, Japan destroyed what no longer mattered while leaving intact what did matter. The 3 carriers that escaped Pearl Harbor hunted down 4 of the 6 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor. The remaining 2, Shokaku and Zuikaku, fell to submarines and aircraft in 1944. The Kido Butai that struck Pearl Harbor was annihilated completely. But the American carrier force that wasn't at Pearl Harbor grew from 3 to more than 50 and ruled the Pacific by war's end. Vindication came with terrible finality in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The surrender ceremony occurred aboard USS Missouri, a battleship, but the harbor was filled with American carriers. The ships that had been absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had returned in overwhelming force. The war that began with Japan's carriers striking Pearl Harbor ended with America's carriers off Tokyo. Yamamoto's prediction had proven accurate. Japan had 6 months of victories, perhaps a year. Then the giant awoke. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.